To wait one more minute, if I get, just in case we're trying to get on.
We are live now on Facebook and on YouTube and on US TV. So when you're ready, Rabbi.
Good evening, friends. On behalf of Woodside Park United Synagogue, Bushy United Synagogue, we are truly delighted to welcome all our viewers from across the country and in fact across the world, joining us for this extraordinary evening. I would like to take the opportunity to thank in particular the professional teams in both respective communities, as well as a special thank you to Rabbi Nick Kett of Bushy United Synagogue for partnering with us. And we'd also like to take the opportunity to thank our very generous sponsors at the Office of the Chief Rabbi. Special thanks to Alex Eagle, who spearheaded this whole project and worked tirelessly to make tonight happen. Friends, for generations, Jews have found themselves facing an existential threat from those that wish to convert us to other faiths. Yet more recently, that threat and that danger has increased as the means utilized have become more subtle, more sophisticated, as covert missionaries posing as Orthodox Jews have infiltrated our own community. Tonight we have an evening of education and insight as we learn and hear firsthand from experts in the field as they share their respective experiences and their wisdom. We are truly honored to be able to welcome the highly acclaimed broadcaster and journalist, Jonathan Sasha Doty, who in fact was instrumental in breaking the story of the missionary activities in the Jewish Chronicle. Jonathan will be our host and our interviewer for tonight. Good evening, Jonathan. Thank you for joining us. We are also delighted to be able to welcome Rabbi Tuvia Singer, CEO of Outreach Judaism, who for decades has been at the forefront of countering missionary and the work of cults through his organization internationally. Finally, we are honored to have Shannon Nuzhan, formerly an evangelical missionary who is now an observant Jewess, founded the non-profit organization Beinenu, which monitors missionary activities both in Israel and abroad, and has unique first-hand experience in this area. Friends, before I hand over to Jonathan, I should point out that there is a chat box on your screens with the opportunity for you to be able to ask questions. And I think one of the most intriguing aspects of tonight will be the conversation and the dialogue and conversation between the presenters and yourselves as the evening proceeds. In addition, there should be a link that will be put on it, a survey, which we would appreciate if you can fill in after the end of tonight's program. So please sit back, and I'm going to hand over to Jonathan as we will hear a fascinating conversation about a very, very pertinent and important conversation. Jonathan.
Well, thanks very much, Rabbi Hackenbrock, and thank you to all of you for being here this evening to learn a bit more about this very unusual subject. And I probably ought to start by saying that I myself first encountered this whole idea of so-called Messianic Judaism not that long ago, probably around a year ago, when I started to write about it for the Jewish Chronicle. A tip had come my way from somebody about a case in Israel, in Jerusalem, which was an extremely interesting case, and I'm sure we'll discuss it a bit in the hour or so after this. But I, through that, of course, got to know two quite incredible figures in this world of dealing with Messianic Judaism, and they are both here tonight. So as far as I can tell, we have really the two world experts on this topic, and I'm very grateful to Shannon Nuzhan and also to Rabbi Tuvia Singer for doing this event, and also for all the work they do in this area. So I'll start by really, I think, probably for the benefit of everyone in the room, taking myself back to that point where I didn't know a huge amount about Messianic Judaism. And I'll just start by asking first, Rabbi Singer, perhaps you could give us a brief summary of exactly what Messianic Judaism is.
Sure. Thank you for having me. The Messianic movement began in 1972. Evangelical Christians realized that they were living in a special time. Fundamentalist Christians, and the people we're going to be speaking about this evening are not Roman Catholics. They're not Orthodox Christians, capital O. These are Protestants, and they're the fundamentalist evangelical Christians, recognize that we're living in a special time, and they felt a need to convert the Jews to Christianity because they believed that, given that Israel has just liberated Jerusalem 5 years earlier, they believed that Jesus' second coming was imminent. However, they were deeply concerned because they believed that the church had largely failed in its effort to bring the Jews to the cross, and they wanted to understand what had the church been doing wrong up until this point, and what could they do differently in order to bring the Jewish people to the cross. Now, Jewish evangelism is very old. It didn't start with the Messianic movement. In fact, it starts all the way in the Christian Bible. But what is different is about the Jewish people is that evangelical Christians
Saying your speaker's not working.
Believe that Jesus cannot make a second coming unless the Jewish people are first converted to Christianity in great mass. It's based on a passage in Matthew 23, last verse 39. We are told, Jesus says, I will not return unless you say, blessed is he that comes in the name of the Lord. The church needed to understand why had they failed in the past. And they recognized that there were two problems in Jewish evangelism, two problems with converting Jews. The first problem was a public relations problem, that Jewish people associate Christianity with persecution. Jewish people, even those who are not involved in Jewish life, are proud of their Jewish identity. But they realized there was a second problem, a more severe problem, and that is that Jewish people didn't want to stop being Jewish. This may come as a surprise to rabbis, but they recognized, they actually gathered in Western Switzerland in 1972 in Lausanne, and they recognized that Jewish people don't want to become Christian because they don't want to stop being Jewish. And they developed the whole Messianic movement then. And that is why in 1973, Jews for Jesus was born. It's called Key 73. The whole Messianic movement explodes at this time because they believed that Jesus' second coming was essentially imminent by the year perhaps 2000. Jerusalem had been liberated, but the Jews need to be brought to the cross. So they developed the idea of blurring the distinction between Judaism and Christianity in order to lure Jews who would otherwise resist a straightforward Christian message. So churches began to call themselves Messianic synagogues. Messianic congregations, they're all over the UK, all over Europe, North America, are churches that are designed to appear as though they're synagogues. We have one in the Old City, an Anglican Messianic congregation, really quite old. The idea is to not have crosses anywhere, to use Jewish liturgy, to use terms like become a believer in Yeshua, the Messiah of Israel, rather than Jesus Christ, where Jewish people feel very uncomfortable with that. So that's how the Messianic movement began, and it has, to the horror of Jewish communities worldwide, been a shocking success, where today in the United States alone, there are well over 1,000 Messianic missions to the Jews. The UK is filled with them. So it's a very, very serious issue.
And so that's a very helpful potted history, really, of how we get to this point. And I think, to summarize, we could effectively say that Messianic Jews are trying to convert regular Jews by covert means without them necessarily even realizing they've been converted to a different religion. But essentially, at the core of that belief, they're meant to accept Jesus as the Messiah, and that will go towards the Christian belief in some parts that that the second coming will only take place when all the Jews have moved to Israel and converted or accepted Jesus in that way. So given that that's the case, Shannon, maybe it would be good to explore a little bit about how this actually looks in real life. I think my first exposure to dealing with this issue in conjunction with both of you was the story of Michael Elkohen in Jerusalem. So maybe you could tell those watching who haven't necessarily followed the story quite so closely as we have, just how that story looked, how it came to be something that you were aware of. And Shannon, I ought to say at this point, and her organization Benenu are extraordinary detectives, unable to really find where these things are going on and unearth what's behind them and the characters who are taking like the leading roles, let's say, in this world of covert missionary activity. So Shannon, could you give us a sort of image of what it looks like, and maybe with reference to the story of Michael Elk or Elkohen?
Well, with Michael Elkohen, I say Michael Elk, it was first brought to my attention sort of from a distance. I was aware of it, but not directly involved. I was volunteering for an organization, simply monitoring missionary activity, but I knew that there were others involved that were directly countering and confronting the issue. It was told to me that he had been found out and was being confronted by 2 different organizations, and that they had they confronted him and made him give 2 written confessions, an oral confession, and asked him about all of his involvement, people that he had converted, what activities has he done, and those confessions were kept. During those confessions, he kept saying that he was tired of living the double life and that he wanted to do tshuva. And tshuva in the Jewish world is a sacred word. We take it very seriously, and we all have the opportunity to do tshuva. It was not known at all that it was not even suspected that he wasn't Jewish. After all, he was a chassid. He was dressed as a chassid. He was a rabbi. He was a sofer. He was a mohel. He was a kohen. He claimed to be a direct descendant of the Baba Sali. So the fact that he wasn't Jewish just never even entered anybody's mind. So at that time, they believed that they were dealing with a confused Jew who had been misled and was now doing tshuva. So they allowed him the opportunity to do that. He also made aliyah to Israel and was living in Israel. It wasn't too long that he sort of dropped off the radar and wasn't noticed or watched anymore or seen anywhere. And it wasn't until his wife became sick with cancer that they had taken on a presence on social media. And that was when it was brought to my attention, because somebody who also knew of the case back in 2014 recognized them on Facebook and said it was suspicious because they have 2 names again and they have 2 separate profiles. And it's clear that those 2 separate profiles, one is a Christian audience and one is a Jewish audience. And then sure enough, there was donations being raised. There was fundraising taking place. There was tremendous amounts of chesed that was pouring in from the Jewish community. But that other profile was raising funds in the Christian world. And the link to donate was Christ's mandate for missions. And that was, we know from his 2014 confession, that is the organization that was paying their salary as covert missionaries. That was what brought it about. From there, we started an intense investigation to build a case. And when I say build a case, that meant proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that this is in fact what they're doing. And the burden of proof is very high.
And I think if I can jump in, that's that's what I found extraordinary as well about this case, is that this was really a case of a man who looked every part the Orthodox rabbi. To his community, he seemed exactly what he said he was. He had developed a very complex backstory about his name, his descendants, or rather his antecedents, his those who come before him, where his Jewish life originated. And of course, to pick someone up on this when you suspect them of being a covert missionary who isn't even Jewish halachically in any way, requires, as you say, a massive burden of proof. And I think that the amount of work that the Nenu put into that was extraordinary. It certainly helped us at the Jewish Chronicle when we were following this story to also pick it up in the US. And using our investigative team there, we were also able to go and meet his family, his first wife, even get photos from his childhood, all of which backed up what we knew, which was that this man wasn't Jewish halachically. There was no evidence that he was a Jew. In fact, there was plenty of evidence to the contrary. And I think that that's part of what made this quite extraordinary. It felt almost like, I don't know if you've seen that TV series, The Americans, about the Russian spies who were embedded in American society for many years. It's based on a true story. And to me, it felt exactly like that. These were people who'd embedded themselves in the Jewish community and even risen to the top. So I think one of the things that shocked me most, and I'd like to ask you both about this, is on the one hand, people would say to me, well, it's fair game, isn't it? If they want to try and offer people a new belief, people have the freedom of choosing whether or not to go along with that. But in actual fact, because of the covert nature of what they're doing, I soon learned that people aren't really being given a free and open choice. And the implications were enormous. So because he's a rabbi, because he's a moel, as far as they were concerned, because he's also carrying out shechita for the community, these had very real practical implications. I interviewed the parents of a child who 8 years previously had had his Brit Milah done by somebody who turned out not to be Jewish. Now that posed halachic problems. And Rabbi Singer, maybe you could jump in there and explain a bit about what the practical problems are when these people are uncovered after many years of that sort of operation.
Yeah, Michael L. Cohen is an extraordinary case. Although this is a picture of what's going on routinely. About an hour before this presentation began, I got a text message from a fellow in yeshiva, in the Baal Tshuva yeshiva here in Jerusalem, who discovered that a fellow he studies with is actually Messianic. And thank God he just sent me a text message that he's agreeing to meet with me. But this is a very serious problem. In the case of Michael L. Cohen, so now you have problems where, he's performing weddings, where he's doing gerus conversions. In some cases, if you have other cases where you can have divorces, which would be the most serious of all. We had quite a number of cases, Jonathan, as you know, of families whose children had a Brit Milah with Michael L. Cohen, and that had to be solved with a Hatafas Dam Bris. So it was a very serious problem. In a strange way, of course, the case was so sensational, it was so striking that it brought an enormous awareness to the problem of infiltration, of the effort of these evangelical Christians engaging in a consumer fraud, which goes to your other point. People might ask, well, Christians want to convert the world. They have a great commission of Matthew 28. They believe that the conversion of the Jews is mandated in the New Testament, and it is. Romans chapter 1, verse 16. Matthew chapter 10, verse 4, 5, and 6 says, go to the Jew first. But the point is, this is a consumer fraud issue. This would be like me dressing up as a Anglican priest, asking people in London, do they want to become a true completed Christian? Would they study the Talmud with me? Obviously, this poses a very serious problem, and people would understand the disappointment in this. And the only way to respond to this is through education. Jonathan, you just covered the case of Yiddish New Testaments, holding one right here, Yiddish New Testaments sent out to families in Muncie, New York. Muncie, New York is all Orthodox Jewish, all religious, Yiddish New Testaments with a return address going to a synagogue, so people would open it and not be concerned. That's completely deceptive. So that's what these missionaries are engaging in. They're designed to deceive Jewish people who would otherwise resist a straightforward message.
And just to say about those Yiddish New Testaments that, as you say, we covered quite recently in the JC with your fine help as well. It's what was particularly scary, let's say, about that case was that, as you say, the return address on the envelope was the local synagogue. So people opened it thinking it had come from their synagogue. They maybe didn't look too closely at what the book was and put it in their shelves, or started to dip into it and read it because it looks like any other work of Jewish scripture. It's been presented deliberately that way and put into Yiddish, following the line of thinking that this is the language that audience might speak. So in effect, it's a bit of a Trojan horse. It ends up in their home. And then, of course, this brings us to the question of who they're actually targeting within the Jewish community. I remember you explaining to me the history of these Yiddish New Testaments, and that they would often be found in Jewish old age homes, where some of the elderly residents who maybe don't have their full faculties anymore, who maybe aren't visited as often as they might be, were visited by people claiming to be rabbis, people who would leave these books there, people who would spend a lot of time with them and help them in prayer. And in effect, what they're doing is taking advantage in that situation of a very vulnerable segment of the community, old people who maybe don't have their full capacity anymore, and they believe that this is something like a deathbed conversion. So in the home, that Yiddish New Testament could perhaps be picked up by a rebellious teenage child or an even younger child who might read it and start not to know what it is, but to follow its teachings. So I suppose what I'm interested in knowing a bit more about at this point is who exactly are they targeting? How are some parts of the Jewish community more susceptible, and who within those parts of the community needs to watch out particularly? So really, who are they targeting among our community? I think either or both of you could really answer this question very well.
I just want to, because you really hit both nails on this one. The people that are most vulnerable are the very young and very old. They're very old because they're dying of loneliness. And as you said, Jonathan, the faculties may not be strong, but they feel deeply alone. And these missionaries are there. They're willing to take care of them. This New Testament, by the way, is not the one that was sent out in Muncie, New York. This New Testament is for Israel nursing homes. So this one is in Hebrew and Yiddish, both, for the elderly here in the Holy Land, who are Yiddish speakers. And the point is, the elderly, they're very, very lonely. And these missionaries are willing to provide for them a family, because their families have abandoned them. That's why there are more Messianic congregations in the state of Florida than there are in any other state in the United States, far more than New York, although New York's Jewish community is more than twice the number of the whole state of Florida. And of course, the very young. The very young know nothing about the faith they're being asked to abandon. They're vulnerable. They are young people, are teenagers, are struggling with self-esteem. They want to belong. They want to join, and these missionaries will embrace them.
I'll add that it's not just the elderly and the young, but any vulnerable populations. I just heard a conference call today at a big missionary organization that's operating right now, targeting Ukrainians coming in. And they talked about the fact that they are specifically focusing on the most vulnerable, the widows, the children, people who are poor and suffering, any sort of vulnerability at all. IDF soldiers, lone soldiers who are here without family, college students are a huge target. Anybody who's in any type of vulnerable situation at all, they are right there.
And how would you say, Shannon, that Christian evangelism is different from other religions like Islam, also, which has a belief that it is superseding Judaism? And how in particular is this type of missionary work, this covert missionary work, different from regular Christianity? Because I think a lot of us have, especially, those of us who live outside Israel, in the UK and the US, we're surrounded by Christian friends. We have plenty of people from a variety of religions around us who are part of our everyday networks at work, socializing, and the like. And I mean, I'm right in saying that you're not warning us off all people of other faiths who are going to be trying to convert us. What is the difference here specifically about these specific types of missionaries, and how do they differ from other religions?
Actually, I'm going to throw that one back to Rabbi Singer.
Right. So every one of you listening to my voice right now has heard of a group called Jews for Jesus. This is not the first time you've heard the name of that organization. Has any of you ever heard of a group called Jews for Allah, Jews for Krishna, Jews for Buddha? We haven't heard about these organizations. They don't exist. So it is quite true that Islam seeks what's called dawah, which means an introduction, means to convert the world. The idea that not seeking a convert is unique to Judaism. But what's different, what is distinct about Christianity is that it is completely willing and able to use deception in order to evangelize. Now, when I say that, Christianity, it really goes back to the earliest surviving literature in the Christian Bible. Paul says this. Paul's letters are the earliest surviving documents we have of the Christian world. All of Paul's letters date to the 50s. 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 20 through 22. Paul says to the Jew, I become as a Jew that I might gain the Jews. To those who are not Jewish, I become like someone who is not under the law, that I may gain those who are not under the law. I can become all things to all men, that by some means I may gain some. There is nothing like that in the Bhagavad Gita. There is no passage like that in the Quran. Paul says in Philippians chapter 1, verse 18. By the way, when I said 1 Corinthians and I said Philippians, for those of you who studied this, know these are among the 7 indisputed letters of Paul. Paul says, whether in pretense or in truth, the gospel is preached. So this wasn't invented in 1972. This has been going on for a very long time. But this iteration is new, but you will not find this in Islam. You have very famously in London, you have the park where everyone gathers and shares their religions, and Christians and Muslims are there. The Muslims are very plain and straightforward. We want you to convert to Islam. Stop keeping Shabbos. Embrace Muhammad as your prophet. They don't say embrace Shlomi as your prophet. So there's the whole distinction. Muslims are very honest about their interest in bringing people to their religion, and Christian missionaries, the people we're going to be speaking about tonight, are not. And this should be an enormous concern to Jewish communities worldwide.
And I think that's, for me, that hits the nail on the head, because what became so fascinating about this area for me, as I realized there's a lot more of it around than I had thought, is exactly that idea, the idea of covert attempts to try to convert Jews. Because really, effectively, it's, as you said earlier on, it's false advertising, false salesmanship, but in the most sensitive part of people's lives, which is their spiritual connection with God or their beliefs religiously. And I think that were anyone of any religion to come and try to convert you openly, it may not be a pleasant experience. You may disagree with the idea, and Judaism isn't an evangelical religion. In fact, we make it very hard for people to convert. I think the part of this that is most shocking and most dangerous and potentially damaging is that it's hidden, that there's, as you say, an attempt to make Christian ideology palatable for Jews who would otherwise not be interested by dressing it up as something else. I mean, I'm in correspondence with a leader of a Messianic Jewish congregation at the moment for a piece I'm working on in the future, and he is adamant that he's not converting anyone. He is sharing good news that he as a Jew believes in. Now, Shannon, I know that you yourself are particularly knowledgeable about this issue because, in a way, you've talked about your experience of it from both sides. And I think if you would, it would be very interesting to hear a bit about how you came to being active in this very unusual but very important area of looking out for these covert missionaries, and how you came really to be involved in running Banana as you do.
Okay, I was two different types of missionary. When I very first started out, it was with a very world focus, and that was a very different technique. It was actually very open, and it was an emotional plea, telling people that there's nobody who's without sin, and there's no possibility for us to stand before a holy God in this sinful, blemished state. And it was an emotional appeal and describing the need for forgiveness of sin in order to have a relationship with God. That I tend to be, I was very good at. But when I turned towards Jews, it was an entirely different approach. It was a whole different way of learning that I had to do, a way of speaking, a way of presenting the gospel, which at the time I justified it and rationalized it as this is the way it has to be done. This is the culturally sensitive way of presenting the gospel, because they're, like Rabbi Singer says, they're going to reject a straightforward message. So it was very deceptive. The language that I learned and how to say things was, you don't say Jesus Christ, call him Yeshua. Don't say a church, say a meeting of Bible believers. Don't say the New Testament, say the Brit Chadashah. Things like that. It was.
And just to recap for those who maybe missed it in the introduction, I hope you don't mind me being more specific about it. The reason you're doing all this is you came from a family of evangelicals who taught you to spread the Christian message, as you said, both to the whole world and then specifically to Jews, right?
Yes, for sure. And part of that was to infiltrate the Jewish community. And that was the way to do that, was to join events at the JCC, be known in the community, volunteer. I would volunteer to deliver Meals on Wheels to elderly, to vulnerable people, to visit kosher restaurants, anything that would introduce me to a Jew, allow me to engage with a Jewish person and establish friendships in the Jewish community.
And at that point, would you tell them you weren't Jewish? Would you tell them you were Jewish? How does it go?
At first, you're just quiet and you're observing and you're listening. I was not deceptive in telling them that I was Jewish. I was quiet at first. Once they did get to know me, I would reveal that I was a Christian. But by then, a friendship had already been established. If we were to meet and I would start speaking about Jesus, I would immediately be labeled a missionary and probably dismissed. But once you create a friendship and you're a friend, you're no longer a missionary. You're just a friend that happens to be a Christian. And in friendships, you have conversations and you discuss things, and naturally religion is going to come up. And of course, because of my training, I was always leading into those conversations so that the Jewish person would ask me about my faith or ask me about religious issues. And I think today you hear a lot of Jewish people who say, I've never been evangelized. A Christian has never tried to convert me. And I can bet that that's probably not true, because I bet they have a Christian friend, and somewhere along the way, that Christian friend has gotten them to pose the question or ask them about their religion. And it's in that way that they're presenting the gospel. And when you're a friend, your defenses are down, and it doesn't feel like they're proselytizing because you were the one to ask. It's all in the way it's done.
And to go to that point really, and it's again a question for both of you really, because I've seen some I mean, they're quite entertaining videos online, but they're also deadly serious, of Rabbi Singer arguing with street preachers in Jerusalem, I believe, who are trying to evangelize. And when it comes down to the texts, this is the interesting thing that I remember you telling me, Shannon. The texts that you were taught to use to preach to Jews were Jewish scripture that was being misrepresented or twisted in a way that would make them feel like they asked you the question. You revealed to them something they didn't know about their own religion, their own scripture, their own books, and that would then be the sort of, you know, the opening of the can of worms. Because once you've made that crack in their own understanding of their religion and you're using their own texts, then you've got a way in. But so I think first I'll ask Rabbi Singer to talk a bit on that subject, on how the texts are twisted and used in that way. And then Shannon, maybe you could explain how your own inquiring mind shifted you away from what you were being taught to say about those texts, and how it really eventually led you to your current life as an observant Jew. So Rabbi Singer, first, will you tell us a bit about those texts?
Sure. So the church wants you to know that Jesus is the promised Jewish Messiah, and it's based on your Bible. This is the message you're going to hear from missionaries. Look at your Isaiah. Jesus bouncing off every page of the book of Jeremiah. He's there. Would you open the Bible with me? And they simply memorize certain verses that are ripped completely out of context. The meaning of passages have been changed. Again, this Jews of Jesus didn't invent this. The author of the book of Matthew starts doing this immediately. There are 11 fulfillment citations in the book of Matthew, where Matthew is allegedly quoting texts from the Hebrew Bible that prophesy that the Messiah will be born of a virgin in Isaiah 7:14. But these passages in the Hebrew Bible are, number one, always ripped out of context, always. Two, the meaning of words have been altered, have been shifted, so that you'd be confronted by someone in Chosen People Ministries, Friends of Israel Gospel Ministries, telling you, Jonathan, why don't you open your own Bible? You're Jewish. Read the book of Psalms. Psalm 22 says that the Messiah, they pierced my hands and my feet. They pierced my hands and my feet. A chapter written by King David 1,000 years before Yeshua. Would you be willing to now accept Yeshua as your Messiah? Only one problem. If you look it up in the King James Bible, it does read in verse 17, they pierced my hands and my feet. But if you open it up in a Hebrew Bible, the text says, Ka'ari yodai v'raglai, like a lion, Ka'ari, like a lion, they're at my hands and my feet. You just imagine just selecting the word like a lion, Ka'ari. You have now white letters on a blue background, delete, the word disappears, and you put in the word pierced instead. And suddenly you have a brand new message. How do you play with the Bible? But if you're not familiar with the book of Psalms, if you're not familiar with the context of Isaiah 53, you don't know that Isaiah 53 is the fourth of four servant songs, missionaries are going to be running all around you. So the texts are always out of context. Words are mistranslated, and they're using King James Bibles or New American Standard Bibles. There's a reason why Christians are not learning the Hebrew language in their schools. I mean, that's just the way. If you want to learn biblical Hebrew, you have to wait till you go to university. And this has an enormous impact on vulnerability. And number three, which would shock you to pieces, and that is verses are invented by missionaries that don't even exist. Passages that, like, the Messiah will be called a Nazarene. He will come from the city of Nazareth. Well, although that literally appears in Matthew 2:23, it literally is in the Christian Bible, there is no such verse. I got more for you. The city of Nazareth is never mentioned in the Hebrew Bible, not once, never mentioned in Josephus, never mentioned in Talmud. So you have these three methods, out of context, changing the meaning of words, and even inventing passages in order to lure people into believing that Jesus could be your promised Messiah.
So, Shannon, let's go back to your story then, thinking of that, having that in mind. You were taught what to say, what to reference. Were you taught that it was deceptive or taken out of context or even made up? Or is that a realization you had to come to on your own?
I'll tell you what Rabbi Singer just said, I was totally oblivious to. And most all Christians are completely oblivious to these things. The way it had happened to me was I woke up every day fully committed to converting as many people as I possibly could. If you could call it a mitzvah, I believed I was doing the ultimate mitzvah, and I was doing the work of God, what he wanted me to do, because I felt he wanted a relationship with his people. And because they were blind and could not accept Jesus, that it was impossible for them to have a relationship with God. And I desperately wanted the Jewish people, his people, to have a relationship with God. And I set out to do that. I believe there are probably many Jews on this call who, if they see a missionary, they get very, very excited because you like to mess with them. Those are the types of Jews that I encountered, and that is sort of what opened up my world. I would engage with these, they were aggressive Jews who sometimes seemed ready for me. They would laugh and make fun of me. They seemed to have cue cards of answers ready to respond to me every time I came. And whatever I came to them with, they would counter and make comments like, what you're saying is out of context. You're mistranslating things, that's made up, which I thought was absolutely absurd. And I knew that there was no way that I was going to get a Jewish person to look at the New Testament, to read the New Testament. It was not relevant to them. They didn't believe it. But I could challenge them and get them to look at their own text. So I set out to learn all of the prophecies that were fulfilled by Jesus in, to me, the Old Testament. And if I could get a Jewish person, I thought, to look at these passages, the passages that I thought clearly showed that Jesus was the Messiah, they're going to see Jesus in those verses just like I did. And I did get them to do that, and I just kept hitting a brick wall every time I would talk to them. They would respond with the out of context, it's made up. So I decided that I was going to try to counter their arguments. They say it's taken out of context. I'm going to present it in context. I'm going to learn the chapter. I'm going to learn the book if I have to. And I'm going to present them Jesus in context like they're asking. They say it's mistranslated. I'm going to try to learn the Hebrew of that verse, and I'm going to show them that it's not mistranslated. And it was when that happened, I encountered a Jewish person who was willing to help me look at the translation so that I could prove it wasn't mistranslated. And I used the most common verse and the one that is most influential in used by missionaries. And I got a Jew to read it for me in the Hebrew. And he became very upset. I thought that I had him. I was for sure that he saw Jesus in that verse and that he really just stopped our learning because he couldn't explain it away. And that person gave me a tape set instead. And that was the audio series by Rabbi Tovia Singer. It's a Let's Get Biblical audio series. It's free online if you want to look it up. But I started to learn that. And that was when my whole world turned upside down. It was an atomic bomb in my life. It was exactly what Rabbi Singer was explaining just now. It, one by one, went through every single one of the prophecies that I had learned was definitely fulfilled by Jesus and completely torn apart. They were mistranslated. They were taken out of context. And that opened up everything for me. It destroyed my life. It created a whole new life. It was devastating, but it is absolutely the most beautiful, wonderful thing that could have happened in my life. I'm very thankful for it. But that was the road that I took.
Well, and I mean, yours is a fascinating story for that reason. I wonder if we could change gear a little bit here and talk about a couple of things, which I know people have been asking about in the chat as well. One is the connection of these types of covert missionaries to the far right in America, and also what part does Zionism play in their activities? Because I think we saw at times, especially during the Trump presidency, some hint that there is a right-wing evangelical Christian body of opinion, which some of this fits in with. And then, as you were saying earlier, Shannon, I think there is a question of aliyah. So in the case of Michael Elkohen, he moved to Israel using the law of return that allows any Jew to go and become Israeli, when in actual fact, there was no documentary evidence that he was Jewish. So, Rabbi Singer, perhaps you could jump in there and address those points.
Sure. The largest voting bloc in the United States are fundamentalist, evangelical, Protestant Christians that embrace an iteration of Christianity. It's called premillennial dispensationalism. As it turns out, the person that triggered it was a fellow from the UK, John Nelson Darby. In the 19th century, he traveled to the United States, and his ideas spread like wildfire. First, let me give you the fact. All missionaries who are engaging in the activity of Jewish evangelism come from the Christian Zionist community. All of them do. As I said, about 1 out of every 5 Americans is deeply committed to bringing each and every one of you to the cross. And the idea essentially evolved in the 19th century. John Nelson Darby essentially upended the way Christians viewed the Jewish people. Until that point, until the 19th century, all Christian denominations, whether they were Roman Catholic, the Church of England, Orthodox, it made no difference, believed in what's called supersessionism or replacement theology. Another term for it is covenant theology. It all means the same thing. The Jews were once chosen, but they're no longer chosen any longer. The blessings were given to the Jewish people in the Old Testament, but now the church is the new Israel. That's the way Christians thought across the spectrum. The Jewish people were no longer chosen. In fact, they were to be a spectacle in Augustine's view of what would happen to a people that would kill Christ in his magnum opus, the city of God. Nelson Darby had a message, and that is, this was all the biggest mistake in the world. And in fact, the covenant God made with the Jews is eternal. Replacement theology is a mistake of the church. And the promises that God made to the children of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are eternal and cannot be undone. This movement was enormous, and it spread like wildfire with other. Cyrus Schofield writes published a very important Bible in the early 20th century. He was a lawmaker from Kansas. James Balfour, every one of you listening to my voice knows exactly who that foreign secretary is and why he's so important. He believed in this. He believed that the Jewish people need to come back to the land of Israel. It belonged to them, every square inch of it. And the Jews have to be brought to Christ in order for Jesus to make his second coming. So it's very much that all the Christians that are called Christian Zionists, the Protestant evangelical Christians, that means we're not talking about Episcopalians. I know you're asking, what about the Anglican Church? You know this as well as anyone. The Anglican Church is very divided. You have a liberal arm of the Anglican Church and a conservative Anglican Church. And although their rituals may be strikingly similar, their beliefs as far as Jewish evangelism and Israel differ greatly. greatly. And all the Anglicans are very pro-Israel. I mean, there's a website called Anglicans for Israel. And these people all believe that the Jewish people need to be here and need to accept Yeshua as the Messiah. So that's where they're all coming from. And so this is a two-pronged issue. One is they believe that the Jews are still chosen, and the promise that God made in Genesis chapter 12, verse 3, I will bless those that bless you, meaning the children of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and curse those who curse you, pertains to today. These Christian Zionists, and there are many, many of them in the United Kingdom, believe that that the very survival of the United States, very survival of the United Kingdom, is that these countries must bless Israel. So that's one belief they hold. The second is that the Jews need to be brought to the cross because of Romans 1:16. I am not ashamed of the gospel. It's the power and the salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew first and then to the Gentile. But they're independent of each other. Okay? So they believe these two things. Here's the caveat. Missionaries will weaponize their Zionism, their Christian Zionism, will exploit their love for Israel, and they know how meaningful that is to Israelis, because in Israel we don't feel like we have a friend in Europe. In Israel we don't feel like we have a friend in the United Nations. In Israel, the feeling in the government, we have a friend, a staunch ally in the evangelical community. Trump's lead attorney, Jay Sekulow. I'm sure you know who he is. He's an evangelical Christian. He's a member of Jews for Jesus and a lead attorney for Jews for Jesus, and is on the board of Chosen People Ministries. So this is huge. So they will then say, look, we're not like the other Christians that persecuted the Jews. We're not like the other Christians who expelled the Jews from England. Oh no, those were not real Christian, because a real Christian loves the Jewish people. So they use their love, affection, and support for Israel in order to evangelize. And one other thing that goes on here that wouldn't go on in the UK as much, that is, they're very ensconced in this country. They're very close to the people in power in this country in a way that you would never see in the United States, because Israel's come to trust them and partner with them. Shannon was instrumental in exposing how the Jewish Agency was using Messianic leaders to run an absorption center and a place for lone soldiers. Mind-blowing. That's what was going on here in the Holy Land.
So in a moment, we'll open this up to questions from all those in the wider audience. Just before we do, on that note, Shannon, I remember being quite shocked with one case that we covered with your help, which was the Joseph Project in Israel. And it's exactly what I think Rabbi Singer was just mentioning, which is that there does seem to be among some in, let's say, government level or Jewish agency or elsewhere within Israel, and indeed I've heard rabbis that I've known and met here in the UK say the same, some sense of, well, they might want to convert us all at the end of days. We'll argue about that then, but in the meantime, they're giving aid to Holocaust survivors or helping New Olim who can't afford any furnishing to furnish their first apartment with donations from Christians around the world. What can be wrong with accepting that sort of help? And to that end, this Joseph Project that we explored in the JC was doing just that. It's a massive agency providing help to Jewish people in Israel in need, whether it's poor people who can't afford school books and school bags for their kids, Holocaust survivors who are living in poverty now, any number of different parts of Jewish society. So can you tell me a bit, Shannon, about that attitude that we encounter in some places and why you feel it might be wrong? But we'll argue about the theology later. For now, they're our best friends. Let's just get along on the stuff we can agree on.
Give me just a minute. Rabbi Singer, could you address the first part of that, and maybe I'll pitch in?
You know, Shannon really, in a very important way, answered this question. I want to just italicize the point that I think many of the people miss. There are rules about Jewish evangelism you never want to forget. 2 of them, and I'm going to share them with you now. And it really goes to the heart of Jonathan's question earlier and what Shannon had shared with you. Rule number 1 is, in virtually all cases, the person who succeeds in converting a Jew, that first contact is not made by a professional missionary. It's not made by someone on the staff of Chosen People Ministries. I am sure there are some of you in this room listening to my voice right now, watching me at this moment, who know of somebody personally that got involved in one of these groups. It might be a cousin of yours. If you asked her, tell me who is the first person to witness to you, it'll be someone who is not Jewish and not a professional missionary. And there is the danger of forging these relationships, these unguarded, unguided relationships with evangelical leaders, because it's exactly what Janet had said. The way missionaries infiltrate the community, the way the conversion is done is through social networking. It doesn't come, hi, read Isaiah 53. That's not how it goes. You become friends. You get to know each other. You have a winery in Israel, and they have volunteers, missionaries who come from all over North America, from South Korea, and they're picking grapes, but they're making friends with the people in communities all over Judea, Samaria, in the heartland of the Holy Land. And then through the network of friendships, they use that to begin to share the gospel. That's how it always works. In the United States, La Leche is loaded. That's an organization that helps new mothers who are nursing, who are very vulnerable, infiltrate that. So the way the missionaries work is 2 things. 2 things have to happen. The person who succeeds is, number 1, not going to be the professional missionary. The role of Jews for Jesus really, therefore, is to train evangelicals in London and New York how to witness to the next door neighbor, their attorney, their physician. And the second thing is they're generally not Jewish. The people who succeed in converting Jews are not people who were once Jewish who converted. The most lethal person, the most dangerous missionary to Jewish communities is a Gentile, a lay Gentile evangelical Christians. Why? Because we've all been raised as Jews to be tolerant of all faiths. And therefore, when we meet a Christian, someone who's never been Jewish, who believes in Jesus, who loves Israel, we'd be very open to a relationship with someone like that. We might feel a kinship with a person like that and certainly not offended by their Christological beliefs. They're not Jewish. It's exactly what you said, Jonathan. And it is precisely for this reason that those who are least offensive are most lethal. And it's the forging of these relationships that are very dangerous. It is certainly true that leadership, whether it's in North America, in Europe, and the UK, will want to work with evangelical leaders personally in support of Israel, for sure. But once you start bringing thousands of evangelicals together with thousands of Jewish people in Houston, thousands of Jewish people in New York, that's where the trouble begins.
And on that, I mean, there is a question that's come in from the chat. Somebody says, question, I have a good Christian friend at work who I think after this talk may be looking to persuade me that Jesus is the Messiah. How should I respond? So this is a good question. What should people listening to this do? Should we mistrust every Christian friend we have? Should we react a certain way when we have that sense?
It's like in any element of your life. It depends on how they behave. If you are engaging with Christians, like the President of the United States, Joseph Biden, who's a devout Roman Catholic, you have nothing to worry about. He's not going to try to evangelize you. Why not play the black piece? If you're wondering how to deal with fellow Christians that you work with, that you meet, that you're engaging with, why not just judge them based on how they behave? If they're respectful of your faith, then what is there to respond to? But if they start saying, have you ever read the book of Isaiah before? Have you ever read Isaiah chapter 7? Did you ever read Daniel 9, where the prophet foretells the precise date of Jesus' crucifixion? Then you know you're dealing with a missionary. And then you have 2 avenues. You can either study this topic very well. You could read my books, watch videos, study the material very well, and then respond in a meaningful way. Jonathan, you spoke before about my engaging with missionaries on the streets of Jerusalem. I have many, many debates that I've engaged with publicly on YouTube, and you could see how I engage with them. So if you know your material, if you're familiar with the text, certainly respond in a meaningful way. Remember, as Shannon has said, these Christians don't know any better. They're reading from a King James, where the text has been completely altered to make it appear Christological. Virtually none of them could speak or read Hebrew. So just respond gently, carefully, and it'll have an enormous impact on them. Conversely, if you're not familiar with the material, if you're not familiar with the text, if you just have yet to read all 66 chapters of the book of Isaiah, all 150 Psalms, if you haven't done that yet, if you haven't read Tanakh yet, it's probably not a good idea to engage in that kind of conversation. You give them my email address. I'd love to speak to them. Connect them with me. So engage with, if they're not trying to evangelize you, some liberal Anglican, you're not going to have a problem. Don't worry about that. But if they do, it depends on your background. If you're knowledgeable, you understand your own faith, then gently respond to all the points that they're raising, and it's going to have a big impact on them. If you're not, it's not a good idea to engage. Send them to me. I'll take care of it.
I happen to think they're very sincere. They're loving people, but they do have an agenda. I said that I believed that I was doing the ultimate mitzvah. I was doing God's work. But there is a common social etiquette that I think needs to be applied here. And when somebody is sharing their faith, if you make it very clear that that's not okay, you respect their religion and their belief, and you demand the same, and that those lines shouldn't be crossed.
There's an interesting question that's just going back a little bit, but who funds them? Somebody's asked, Stella has asked, who's funding them? Now, and this is interesting, I think, because in the explorations and discussions we've had over the last year or so, you've really opened my eyes to the idea that actually it's a very well-structured pyramid, let's say. So you don't just end up being a very convincing fake rabbi in French Hill, Jerusalem. There's an awful lot behind that got you there. The same with the story of the Dawsons, who were a Messianic father and son outfit who were working in Arizona and had infiltrated a Baharian Jewish community there and were acting as the rabbi and lay leader of the community. So how are those people getting there? What's the money behind it? What's the process behind it? How did they learn how to act like Jews? But above all else, this sounds expensive. Can you shed some light on how that happens?
There are many organizations who are dedicated to covert missions. We've uncovered quite a few. Jonathan, we've gone back and forth over lots of these organizations and the training materials that we've downloaded and gotten a hold of, and how they're placing them in Jewish communities. They're given homes, they're given training. They are enrolling in language programs, especially Yiddish programs. There's a tremendous effort to target the most religious. They call them the unreached people groups in religious communities, Hasidim, and they're paid good money to do this. That was how we uncovered the connection in the salary that Michael Elk was getting. Going back to what we had said before with the government involvement, the level at which the missionaries are ensconced with our government is very, very concerning. And I think the silence that's come from the government since all of your cases have come out is very disturbing. You've reported case after case, and it's gotten a lot of attention, and it has been picked up by international media. It's been covered around the world. If I Google our cases, I can find them in just about every language, but it's very interesting that I'm not seeing those cases covered in Hebrew. I have a relationship with maybe one journalist who has taken some of our cases here in Israel, and I think that's a question that the Israeli public needs. I mean, the Jewish world needs an answer to, because it's not because people don't care. These stories wouldn't be picked up and continue to go if people didn't care. It's the awareness that's been brought to the public has been tremendous, and there's been a response from the public at large, but there's been a deafening silence with our government and leadership. And B'naiinu is not a government entity. We are not a government organization. I'm not the head of some big, giant investigative firm. It is a nonprofit. It was founded by a private citizen individual, just like most every other Jew here in Israel. And our goal is simply to bring awareness that I think the Jewish world has not been aware of, and it's been happening under the radar, and these relationships have been happening right under our noses, and people are completely unaware. Now that we have the awareness, I think our goal with what we're doing is to empower the Jewish world, the Israeli public here, to act and to call our leaders responsible and demand answers. This is something that affects every aspect of the Jewish world, every type of Jew across the spectrum, and it's going to take all of us, not just one organization, to demand answers and demand action and say that this is not okay. We appreciate Christian support. We love that they're ready to support us, that they stand with us against issues like combating anti-Semitism, but we do have to draw the line when it comes to converting our people. And the fact that there's silence and there are relationships going on and the foothold that evangelicals have here, I think that needs to be investigated and answered.
And there's a question that's come in now, actually, which is, I think, an interesting one to move on from that, which is what happened to the El Cohen / Elk family after he was exposed, asks Saskia. And I think that's an interesting one, actually, to explore, because it is, to my mind, a really good example of how this danger doesn't just go away with a bit of sunlight. Because, in fact, I remember the Elks were already exposed once and then kind of managed to re-infiltrate and carry on doing what they were doing. And then the same happened with the Dawsons in Arizona. We ran a little bit of a follow-up of seeing they were, even after the whole thing was exposed, they then reappeared at a Hanukkah event, still dressed up every bit as Orthodox Jews. So can you, Rabbi Singer, perhaps pick up on what should happen next? You know, B'naiinu does this good job of raising awareness. They're exposed. People learn that they're there. How can these people reappear and keep working on it? And what can we do about that?
Right. If the answer to the problem of Christian missionaries infiltrating the Jewish community is not education, then everything Shannon is doing and everything I am doing is wrong. The key of our organizations, our work, is education, enlightening Jewish communities around the world about the efforts of these Christian missionaries. Michael Alcone is not going on the way he has. In fact, he's shaved his beard off, shaved his payas off. He's not wearing a kippah, and his children are no longer dressing like Beis Yaakov girls. So he's taken that route, and he's still doing jiu-jitsu classes, but he doesn't look anything like what he used to look like. The Dawsons, they're looking that way, but the whole world knows about them. Thank goodness to the work of Shannon, to your coverage of the case and your expose of this. So it's all about education. Now, people being aware of who these groups are, they're infiltrating Jewish communities. We have another case in Chicago. They look like they come from Gateshead, and they're complete missionaries. So it all has to be education. The Jewish community must know about the danger of these missionaries, why they're doing it, how they're doing it, And then with that kind of knowledge, then you have power. That's the only thing that could protect Jewish communities worldwide. I should just mention one other thing. As Shannon said, hundreds of millions of dollars spent annually on Jewish evangelism. The monies are coming from the United States, Canada, a lot coming from South Korea. So, but there is one angle to this that should be mentioned that goes to the education part. These missionaries are completely reliant on these funds coming from where we would expect them to come from. But as it turns out, they have to go on Morning Star TV, Michael L. Cohen case, in order to raise money. The Joseph Project has to do videos, do interviews, how we're bringing Jewish people to know about Yeshua in Sderot, a little town just outside of the Gaza Strip. Beleaguered people who have to deal with the missiles coming from Gaza. So because the Joseph Project, because the Messianic Jewish Alliance of America, because Chosen People Ministries has to ask for that money, they therefore have to advertise what they're doing. And that gives us an enormous advantage in being able to expose this kind of nefarious work.
Absolutely, and I think yes, again, I apologise and also don't apologise for being the journalist in this discussion. So sometimes we do look for the even in a very serious subject like this, we look for the more human interest angle, let's say, or occasionally something that might raise a smile or a laugh, and that was something you're quite right to point out, that when the El Cohen story came out, there was that follow-up with those photographs that surfaced of how he looked once he'd shaved off his beard, and he looked every part the kind of 21st century hipster. And so we had there this montage, effectively, of how he'd looked when he was growing up, because one of the things we'd been able to do during the investigation before publication was meet members of his own family who openly and willingly told us they weren't Jewish, they had no Jewish heritage, and he wasn't Jewish, and they opened up family albums to let us have pictures of him in school plays and his life before he looked Jewish. Then there was, of course, the picture of him looking very Jewish, and then it came around full circle, and there are the pictures of him still in Israel, still, as you say, taking part in what he could, though it's not religious anymore. So I think awareness is absolutely a key part of all of this, and it's very much thanks to the fine work that both of you are doing, that I think more and more people within the Jewish community are aware of this phenomenon. And I plan to continue with your help to cover these stories as long as we're finding them, because they're quite shocking and they're very important, I think, for people to realize. So I think on behalf of probably everyone watching here, I can say a great big thank you to both of you for this difficult and important work. And I'll hand back to the rabbis, not Rabbi Singer, but the other rabbis perhaps at this stage, and also thank them very much for having us all involved and for bringing this event to the internet so that people could tune in and listen. I hope it's been of interest.
Thank you so much
Thank
to you,
you,
Jonathan. Thank you to you, Shannon. Thank you to Rabbi Singer. And thank you to all of you so much for being here this evening. This topic first came onto my radar when I first learned of Shannon's story. And my original thought had been just to hear her speak so passionately about her life story and where it's taken her. And then this whole world opened up in front of me. And I'm just so grateful that we've been able to bring all of you together and share everything that you've shared with us, and to hear all the vital and important work that you've been doing and the passion that you have for everything that you do. We're just so grateful to all of you for being with us tonight. If anybody wishes to make contact with any of our speakers this evening, perhaps we can find a way of getting contact details or visit their websites, check out their content online. There's lots more. You've only just opened up the world of seeing what they're able to contribute. And just to thank you all so much once again for being with us this evening. And thank you to Rabbi Hackenbroch and the team at Woodside Park for being so easy to work with. And please God, there should be more opportunities in the future for us to all collaborate together, whether it's on this topic or other topics. But once again, thank you all, and have a safe journey home, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.